An Ironman 140.6 triathlon is long enough that small mistakes can completely ruin your race. In this video, I'll share 5 of the worst things you can do during an Ironman and the simple ways to avoid them. Finishing an Ironman 140.6 is rarely about one heroic moment. More often, it's about avoiding the mistakes that can slowly ruin your race. Over the course of 140.6 miles, or 226 kilometers, pacing errors, nutrition mistakes, equipment issues, and environmental factors can gradually push your body beyond what it can handle. Many athletes train very hard for months, only to see their race fall apart because of something relatively simple. The good news is that most of these problems are completely avoidable with the right preparation. And one of these mistakes in particular is responsible for far more Ironman struggles than most athletes realise. Interestingly, the biggest Ironman mistakes usually happen early in the race, long before the marathon even begins. So let's look at the 5 worst things you can do during an Ironman and what you can do instead. One of the most common mistakes in Ironman racing is pacing the early stages too aggressively. It often starts in the swim. Your adrenaline is high, everyone around you is swimming hard, and it's easy to get caught up in the pace of the group. But if you push too hard early on, you end up starting the bike section already carrying significant fatigue. The same thing often happens on the bike. Athletes leave transition feeling strong and then ride harder than planned, especially in the first hour. But an Ironman bike leg is 112 miles and the marathon is still waiting afterwards. How you ride the bike has a huge influence on how well you run the marathon. Some athletes approach the race almost as if it were 3 separate events, trying to set their best time in the swim, the bike and the run. But that way of thinking almost always leads to pacing mistakes and a painful marathon experience. One year I raced Ironman Florida in unusually cold conditions. I was so cold at the start of the bike that I rode harder than usual just to warm up. But by the end of the ride I could hardly pedal, and the marathon went badly because my legs kept seizing up. That day I learned the hard way how important bike pacing is in an Ironman. Since then I've had much better results simply because I kept the early part of the race under control and still had the legs to run a solid marathon. A useful way to think about pacing is to treat each discipline as part of one long all-day event. Ask yourself this: how fast would I swim if I had to keep swimming all day long? How hard would I ride if I had to keep riding all day long? Because in an Ironman, you will essentially be exercising all day long, and that's how the effort needs to feel in each individual part. If you're using a power meter on the bike, the longer your race is likely to take, the lower the percentage of your FTP you should generally ride at. As a rough guide, many athletes will ride at about 65 to 75% of their FTP, or functional threshold power, in an Ironman. Faster athletes tend to sit toward the top of that range, while athletes racing for longer tend to sit toward the lower end of that range. It's also important to keep your effort steady. Try to avoid big spikes in power, especially on climbs. Many well-paced Ironman bike rides end up with a variability index of around 1.03 to 1.06, which simply means your power stayed fairly consistent throughout the ride. These ranges help keep the bike leg manageable while leaving enough energy for the marathon. In Ironman racing, the fastest athletes are the ones who show the most patience early in the day. Aerodynamics matter in long-distance triathlon, especially over 112 miles or 180 kilometers of cycling. But one of the biggest mistakes athletes make is chasing an extremely aggressive aerodynamic position that simply isn't comfortable enough to hold for the full bike leg. This is actually something I've experienced myself. I went for an aerodynamic bike fit, hoping to gain a bit of free speed. And on paper, the position I had looked faster, but I quickly realised I couldn't hold it for very long without developing a very sore neck. Thankfully, I was only racing an Ironman 70.3 that day, rather than a full Ironman, but even so, my neck was still sore for about 3 months afterwards. If your position causes neck pain, lower back discomfort or hip tightness, you'll probably find yourself sitting up frequently or shifting around constantly. And when that happens, you lose the aerodynamic advantage anyway. More importantly, an overly aggressive position can also compromise your run. Tight hip flexors and a fatigued lower back can make the first miles of the marathon feel much harder than they should. The key is finding a position that is both aerodynamic and sustainable. A slightly less aggressive position that you can comfortably maintain for several hours will almost always be faster overall than a position that looks fast but forces you to sit up every few minutes. Heat can dramatically increase the difficulty of an Ironman. Even if the race temperature doesn't seem that extreme, spending 10 to 14 hours exercising outdoors can place a significant strain on your body's cooling systems. If you haven't prepared for this, your heart rate tends to rise, perceived effort increases, and dehydration becomes more likely. Heat acclimation can actually help reduce these effects. One simple approach I sometimes use is wearing an extra layer of clothing during certain training sessions. I don't do this during my high-intensity workouts because it adds too much stress. Instead, I only do it during easier or steady Zone 2 sessions. It's not quite as effective as training in a hot climate or sitting in a sauna after training each day, but it can still help your body get better at regulating its temperature. Even relatively small amounts of heat exposure can improve your body's ability to regulate your temperature and maintain your performance. This next mistake is probably responsible for more DNFs than almost anything else. Some athletes underfuel and gradually run low on energy. Others consume more carbohydrate than their digestive system can comfortably handle, leading to nausea and stomach issues. The same applies to hydration. Drinking too little can contribute to dehydration and poor performance, whereas drinking too much can dilute your sodium levels in your blood, causing other problems. When it comes to nutrition, a good starting point for many athletes is practicing carbohydrate intake of around 60 to 90 grams per hour during long training sessions. So that's typically around 3 energy gels as an example. Hydration needs, on the other hand, vary much more between athletes, which is why it can be helpful to test your sweat rate. One simple way to do that is by weighing yourself before and after a training session in similar conditions. That gives you an estimate of how much fluid you typically lose. Some athletes also lose a lot more sodium in their sweat than others, which is why sweat testing can help identify whether you may need additional sodium as part of your hydration strategy. The key point is that nutrition and hydration strategies should be personalised to your needs and well rehearsed long before race day. Ironman race day is not the time to experiment. New nutrition products, unfamiliar drinks, different gels, new clothing or equipment you haven't used before can all introduce unnecessary risk. Even something simple like a new pair of socks can cause problems if you haven't tested them during long training sessions. The same applies to equipment. Small mechanical issues can become major problems during a 112-mile bike leg. Old tyres, incorrect tyre pressure, poorly maintained drivetrains, or electronic shifting systems that aren't fully charged can all create avoidable race day problems. The goal is simple really, remove as many unknowns as possible. If something hasn't been tested properly in training, race day probably isn't the time to introduce it. And that's one reason my Ironman training plans include race rehearsal workouts. These sessions reproduce key aspects of race day but without the full distance or fatigue of the actual event. And they're a great opportunity to test your pacing, nutrition, clothing and equipment and make sure everything works smoothly before race day arrives. If you're looking for a structured plan, you can check them out at myprocoach.net or via the link in the description. They're designed to be affordable and include email coach support if you need extra guidance. So I'd be really interested to hear your experiences here. What's the biggest mistake you've either made or seen others make during a full Ironman? Let me know in the comments. And if you're preparing for a long distance triathlon such as an Ironman, I do recommend watching the video that's appearing on screen right now. You might also enjoy the How to Prepare for an Ironman 70.3 triathlon playlist, which includes more training advice for long course racing. And if you'd like more triathlon coaching advice in the future, please don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.